He aha te kai o rangatira. He kōrero, he kōrero, he kōrero. What is the food of the leader? It is knowledge, it is communication. So welcome everybody. I have apologies from Robert and Stuart. Nicole is here somewhere, but we'll just take those two.
I'll move
Lyndall, seconded by Phil. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
It's carried. Any declarations of interest today? No public forum that I'm aware of. Minutes. Minutes of the last meeting held on the 14th of August. So we'd like to move it to true and correct record.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Is there a second for that?
Yep.
Lyndall. Lyndall, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Okay, it's carried. No extraordinary or urgent business. Any questions? No questions? Any reports from anybody? Okay, it's all very easy. So we'll go on to item 9, the reports. And 9.1 is our second greenhouse gas emissions annual report, and welcome Neil again. Thank you for getting all of this sorted. Now, would you or Anko like to highlight the points in this?
Thank you, Morris. Well, look, because it's a large report, we thought we'd do a brief presentation just to, I guess, highlight the key aspects and provide a point of conversation.
Yeah.
So we have a presentation behind you, Chair, that we'd like to work through.
Okay.
So to kick things off, so a bit of background. So obviously last year we completed the baseline. The approach that we take. Sorry, is that shared on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the approach that we've taken has complied with the International Standard Organisation's procedures around greenhouse gas calculations. We did follow an interagency approach towards establishing our organisational boundary, and so we did work with ICC, GDC and SDC in developing that approach. We developed our greenhouse gas inventory. Now, our inventory is essentially a list of our emission sources. It collates the sources' respective activity throughout the period, and then it applies the Ministry for the Environment's emission factors to come up with a figure, which is your total emissions. Our total emissions last year was 2,116 metric tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. Our inventory was verified by Toitu, and then we developed our greenhouse gas measurement operating procedure or manual, which obviously is very good practice because it means that we are consistent and we have a basis which we can build on for continuous improvement and for ensuring consistency of approach. This year, our total emissions is 2,085 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is a reduction of 30.76 tonnes. Now, there's a little bit of devil in the detail. You'll recall last year we made a point of separating business as usual emissions from capital and extraordinary project emissions. And it was somewhat for this purpose because this year our business as usual emissions did increase. So they've increased by 57 tonne, but the capital and extraordinary projects aspect of that is reduced by 88 tonne. So the reason why we did that is really so because there are two different approaches. The BAU stuff is we put a longer term reduction plan around that, whereas the capital is more short-term and fleeting. So generally, in an ideal situation, you'd be giving consideration to the emissions at the time of scope, and you'll have awareness of that, and you might give some consideration to that. And of course, the capital and extraordinary activity is very, very lumpy, whereas the BAU stuff is a bit more linear. So it's a very high-level comparative, and the key call out here is you'll see that the orange wedge in the 2023 emission contributors is gone. That was the embodied emissions fundamentally in the development of Stead Street. There was a significant amount of steel and concrete which has an embodied emission in it. So there was some in this year, but it was the bulk of the procurement was done last year, so it was minor, and it's now in the other. You'll also note that there's a reasonable increase in the transportation and work-related emissions, and that's that is a lot of that's come from, dare I say it, from diggers and moving rock, because I guess there's been, and you'll know more than I, but there must have been quite a lot of work in flood protection, and that's shown through there. So dig into the detail a little and set out what are the variations between the FY23 baseline and this year. First one, stationary combustion. Now I've highlighted this. This is not a change of our activity, but this is a change in the MFE emissions factor. So that did increase quite substantially. The emission factor increased quite substantially, which has resulted in that change. And this is there are a number of changes in emission factors from MFE. So they are continually looking to, they're working with science to try and perfect and improve on what their emissions factors. So that is the norm. The size of the increase of that was probably a little bit unnatural, or a little bit outside the ordinary, but it continually moves. The other one that I wanted to highlight was our transport fuel. So there was a reduction in council burning 2,630 less litres of fuel, as well as a transition from diesel toward petrol. And we haven't done a in-depth analysis, but with another hat, I'm aware of the change that the council's had on their fleet, and I'm suggesting anecdotally that perhaps some of that change in the fleet has resulted in that change. The other big change was the purchased energy, where there was a significant increase in the amount of kilowatt hours used, with it going from 490,000 to essentially 590,000. I have highlighted that the Stead Street pump house was a significant contributor within that space, contributing another 73,000 kilowatt hours of consumption.
Can you ask questions as we go?
Yep, I'm happy. Sorry, Morris.
I just wanted to clarify, is that the old Stead Street pump station?
Well, no. So that's the amount of energy consumed over the calendar year up to 30 June.
So, but not in the construction of a new. I'm assuming it's.
It'll be both. The old pump house and the new one. Right. Now, I don't know to what extent the new one was fully commissioned at that time, but presumably there was trials and activity and work being done that would have contributed to that. But as far as projecting what it might look like next year, I guess there is an opportunity, I guess, for people to look now and have a look on a month-by-month basis, maybe project forward as to what it might look like.
Peter?
Yeah, just want to say that just over that 2,000 metric tonnes isn't a bad figure.
Yes.
I think it's pretty reasonable. When I look at that, it's probably about 60 hectares of pines could cover off that, but I don't want to go there, but those opportunities may be be apparent later on in managing a transition. So I think it's pretty good, and the boundaries are reasonably wide. If once we start to tighten them up, I wouldn't assume that we will continue with accounting for contractors. I would think over time we will put the onus back on them to do their own work and provide their own evidence of their mitigations in time. I'm just assuming.
Yeah, because we are engaging them to do our work and we're in control of that, they come in as one of the scope 3. They are within our boundary. So they are a scope 3.
And they will remain and stay.
And that work that they do on behalf of us will remain within our calculation. Having said that, the opportunity then is when we are procuring, that we are selecting contractors that have done good work and that their level of emissions, are controlled.
So that'll help with the damage.
That would help. That'll be one of the opportunities that council has in a reduction program is to select, contractors that, when the procurement is being done and you've got your RFP that you're asking questions about their level of procurement to provide the service. Their level of emissions to provide the service, and you take that into consideration.
Is there, just sorry, Mr. Chairman, if I could, just another further question. Is there any thinking to be given around at what level we can mitigate? So I wouldn't assume that we're not going to go right back to zero, but of what emissions we can live with that we can offset.
So the general guidance, we sort of covered that off a little bit last year, is that in the first instance, you should be trying to reduce. Within your own boundary, you've got the opportunity to remove.
Yeah.
So removal is what you're suggesting in terms of maybe planting forest, native forest or pine or whatever it might be. And then the offset is really used when you start using the emission trading scheme and you're buying credits on that market. So so it's removal is probably what you're sort of thinking about, which still sits within our boundary. And we have some removal already, obviously, in terms of we've got some native forestry, which is part of our inventory. But we've got probably more opportunity because there's a few more slides that we might be able to talk about some of those aspects later on.
Thank you.
Just moving on. So as we saw on the pie charts, there was a moderate increase in transportation and related services, and this one here, and so that one is largely in relation to, or what's included in that is our heavy haulage for our rock transportation for the flood bank work, as well as any aircraft flying or helicopter activity and what have you. So they sit within there. The business travel. So the business travel is interesting because whilst the emissions have come back, that reduction is more about MFE's emission factor than any reduction in our actual air travel. So we have travelled more, but the emissions is less. And the other one there, the works-related products and services. So this is largely diggers and graders and that type of work. There was so last year we had, when I say last year, so the last report, which was the 22-23 financial year, there was quite a lot of activity with regards to removal of Undaria. And because it was abnormal, we treated it as one of the, within the capital and or extraordinary
Aberration.
The apparition's turned into a BAU now. so there is a slight, so whereas in the 22-23 year, the Undaria activity was 91 tonnes of emission. In this year, it was 38. So, but it's gone from in that capital and extraordinary up into the BAU. So that's another part reason for an increase of BAU activity there. And that partly explains why there was a reduction in the capital and extraordinary projects, as well as because a lot of that last year was Stead Street. And then in 4.6, you can see there's a significant reduction in the embodied emission, because whilst we did purchase some concrete and steel, it was significantly less than what was required in the previous year. So that's a bit of a summary on the key variations. Just an overview statement of how the process was, and I would suggest that improvements were made. I guess the first thing is, I think, if you recall, doing the baseline year, that was us sort of starting from scratch and developing and figuring things out. The FY24 year, in my view, has validated that. I think we didn't come across any changes or changes or anything of significance that undermines the baseline year. And as I say, I think it more actually validates that what was done in the baseline year was fair and appropriate, and yeah, similarly this year we can hold it with a higher degree of confidence, and having gone through a different verification with a different set of verifiers was good as well, because they had a different lens. The invoice, and administratively, because we did this after the financial year, procedurally it was just a whole lot easier just to collate all the invoices. There was an improvement in supplier data. Now, this is probably not because we've gone back and asked for improvements, but I think it comes back to that we've selected suppliers that are possibly a little bit better in this space, and so they are collating for their own purpose their diesel consumption, and it's their biggest cost. So we've used more suppliers that are doing that, and if they can tell us the diesel consumption relating to their work that they're doing for us, that makes this process a whole lot easier. And so, we have moved up, overall, we have moved up that data quality scale. And as I say, emphasis on diesel consumption, and we did make some changes, because that is a very, very, from our perspective, and discussing it, and from the supplier's perspective, it's a very, very easy thing to quantify and say, look, how much diesel did you consume? And then we've got an emission factor that's sitting there ready to use. The audit was very quick and efficient, and I'm just making a note that the operating manual was updated, so we're in a good position for rolling that forward. A couple of other comments that I just wanted to make, and it's more about maybe cutting some conversation off at the pass and just providing clarification over another point. So the leasehold land, so we did, within this report, we specifically highlighted the leasehold land is excluded. Now, it's excluded because, so if you go back to the organisational boundary that we have set, it is based on operational control, with operational control being further defined that we as an entity have the ability to control their policy, their health and safety policy, their environmental policy, and what have you. Now, we don't have that ability to do that with any of our lessees. So that's why they are outside of our boundary. That's not to say that we don't take some overview or some oversight and try to do something, but from as far as compiling your greenhouse gas footprint, they sit outside the boundary. I wanted to clarify that. And the other one that I wanted to clarify was the difference between emission trading scheme and removal. So council does have some forestry that is part of the emission trading scheme, and I just wanted that if we were to plant more trees, then we have the choice. Either they can be used to obtain credits from the emission trading scheme, or they get used as removals from our inventory. It's not both. Because if you think the whole purpose of the emission trading scheme is we're providing a mechanism for someone else to pollute. So that's what you're selling when you sell your credit on the emission trading scheme, is you're selling a credit for someone to burn 1 tonne of, generate 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. So we just need to be very clear about that it's an either or. And back to what Peter was saying, we've probably got some requirement at some point in time to use planting to remove some of our emissions, because we're not going to get to zero otherwise.
Yeah. That, Peter?
Yeah, I just want to ask a question about your leased land. And thanks for cutting that off at the pass.
That's
But I totally agree with you, because I don't know what status we have as a council of the land technically we administer to use that land for our purposes, or whether that should be used for the purposes of the community as such. So I haven't quite got my head around that. Or do we think it's our land, we can use that land to offset or do what we want with, or is that a community resource?
Yeah, I would, and applying the principles here of compilation exercise. So we own that land. So if we were to plant trees on that land, that would, based on this, would be a removal that we could take within our boundary. Yeah,
Well, I think that's a moral question. I don't know the technicalities around that.
Yeah, so I'm saying that's my view from applying these rules. So and I suppose if we are investing in the planting, and depends what it is, it does fit within the boundary based on the definitions here
of the work you're doing. But I think that should be a future discussion for this council of, is it ours? Do we administer on behalf of the public? Those sorts of questions, and that might give some direction to how we use that in the future.
To be fair, everything this council does is on behalf of the public. So the flood bank work that is generating a lot of the emissions is on behalf of the public. So I'm not sure I'll let you get into the philosophical discussion.
Yeah, it is. So my question really goes back to using that land for our own benefit as an entity. Is it?
And I guess in some respects we are already using it for our benefit. It's just that we're using a different mode.
Yes.
And it's whether we would choose to repurpose it to an offsetting function as opposed to currently a revenue generating lease to a farmer.
Yes, quite a difference there, I'd say.
And of course you might in due course calculate, maybe it makes more sense to continue earning money off that, purchase somewhere elsewhere and offset somewhere else potentially. There's a whole range of things you could like pull the levers differently, I would imagine, in terms of the equation for how to get the best outcome from the resources we've got.
So I didn't really get that actually. I thought you could have your cake and eat it too, but obviously
this is the emission trading scheme and removals.
Yeah.
That's why I put that comment there.
Yes, very good, Neil. I'm not sure how widespread people understand that. It's so we can, if we wanted to use it to reduce our overall net emissions, we can't have it in the ETS. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So if you think it in terms of that land, those trees, they have a removal.
Yeah.
And whatever that removal is, let's say it's 5 tonne of carbon. We can either, that gives us an ability to emit 5 tonne of carbon into offset, or we sell that to someone else and they can emit 5 tonne of carbon and offset. So it's either or. It's not both.
Well, thank you for explaining that. That's very good. Well, it's not good really because but no, it makes perfect sense when you explain it. So the question then is how how are we going to reduce our emissions in a significant way, or should we just rely on, I know in the report it says you've got to try and reduce emissions first.
Yes.
But looking at all the things that are in there that cause them, like the heavy machinery building stop banks and doing work like that, you know, unless all those contractors have electric diggers, then we're not really going to be able to get around that in the foreseeable future, are we? So the question is, how can we can plant trees on our, that would be a thing to do, I suppose, but we wouldn't
Or
get
wetlands.
money from it. Well, wetlands, I don't think you can quantify the carbon gain from wetlands, can we?
There's shortcomings in what MFE allow to be included within your inventory as a removal source. They are quite prescriptive and even like, and I know this has come up before in terms of you know, windbreaks and what have you. They don't comply with the MFE requirements. So they don't get it.
Can I follow that up, Chairman? Because I read a report a couple of weeks ago which quantified with great accuracy the loss of carbon from the fires down at Awarua. So how can they accurately measure that, but not accurately measure what happens when you create a wetland to absorb carbon? It seems a total anomaly to me, and a landscape that's tipped one way. You agree?
It's draining in London.
Or explaining?
So one thing I will, which is going to do neither of what you asked for, but one thing, the way that the MFE works is that it takes 100-year time frame. So when you grow the tree, if it's removing a certain amount of carbon, if you then burnt that tree, then that emits the same amount of carbon. So it's a net. There's no change as a result of growing the tree and burning that tree. Hence, our boiler, which is on wood pellets, there is the emissions that come from that is not about carbon dioxide. It's not about burning wood. It's about the nitrous and the methane that comes out of it.
Right.
So that's why I'm surprised about the whole that burning, that forest burning,
but
because that removes carbon and then emitted carbon.
Supplementary, Mr. Chairman. So there's no credit because we're now not burning coal, which would have.
But burning coal would be bad.
Yeah, well, so we're not doing that anymore. We're burning wood pellets, which are neutral, but technically there is no gain.
No, so if we were burning coal, you would have a significant emission.
Yeah.
Because we're burning wood, we don't have a significant emission. We have
So
a minor
that
emission.
just comes off our gross.
We still have emission with wood.
Right, okay.
You'd have a bigger.
Sorry, I'm a granddad. You just got to be gentle with me.
Can one of the young ones explain it to him, please?
Draw a picture.
As long as they're planting a forest and you're taking that forest to burn, that's fine, but there is still emissions from burning timber, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah, so as long as you're planting those trees in behind.
But we don't capture that. So the person that cut down the tree to make pallets, they would have to be responsible because they grew that tree and then cut down that tree. If they didn't plant another tree, then they would be responsible for the emissions of that tree.
Yes.
That makes sense?
Right, yeah.
So who's got a question?
Well, I was just going to observe it. My understanding is I kind of think of the MFE rules around how to do this. They're like the accounting standards that our accountants and finance people want to.
Similar.
And you can have
good analogy.
And you can have black market transactions and other ways of making money and under the desk payments, which are not going to be visible in your financials for your business. And that's a bit the same here, I would imagine. You can hypothetically calculate how much carbon might be lost from burning a wetland or a piece of forestry. But the important thing is that we are kind of consistently and openly and transparently adhering to a set of accounting principles to how we measure our emissions.
Agreed, and that's why getting the Toitu verification is useful, because that's making sure that we're not dealing in the black market and the dark arts that you might be suggested.
Amy, did you?
So, yeah, thank you. So I've sort of just joined the table, so I come back and answer Morris's original question, which is, how are we going to achieve our carbon net zero goal? And, as part of the discussions that this committee has been having along, that path is not clear. We're all on a learning journey all at the same time. So I'm in the process of contracting in someone who's got a little bit of skills in this area to come in, support us to write a strategy and develop an approach. Because I'm conscious that given the knowledge base and understanding that we all have, we can fire off in lots of different directions and do bits, which might be helpful, but also might have a disproportionate effort to outcome ratio. So there's something about how do we have a joined up approach to this? And there's a couple of things that I'd probably like to say in relation to that. It comes one bit comes back to the measurement piece, which Neil's talked about. We've got two ways we create emissions, and one's in our BAU, and then the other part is, from time to time we might do some, significant works. So depending on and they are, I'd say, more heavily CO2 producing than perhaps our business as usual is. So we're always going to get some unders and overs and variability and all of that. And so I would foresee, the personal view here, that a key thing for us as an organisation, we need to focus on both, but significantly in the BAU space, there's probably more there that we can control, and then the when we're doing the works, but it's how are we engaging. So to Neil's point about procurement, how are we engaging with suppliers, and how are we making emissions and low emissions part of our procurement process to try and exude as much control as we can there, acknowledging they're doing the work for us, but they're doing the work. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing I just like to point out is I suspect this journey is not going to be similar to the journey we're having in the water space, which is we don't have all the answers right now. We're starting this journey, and given the length of time that we've got to go, technology will change, our thinking will change, there will be innovation in this space. So we're constantly going to have to, I think, cast the fishing net out, row the boat over to where the net is, and then see where we are there, and then cast the net out again. So this is going to be an iterative process for us. I don't think this is going to be a linear journey by any stretch of the imagination. That's not a reason not to start, and we will be starting. And actually, if I can get the person that I'm speaking to contracted, I'm hoping that we'll have at least a draft plan before Christmas or early in the new year, which we can have discussion about internally and bring back to you.
Thanks, Amy. That's very good. I was talking to Anko about that just before the meeting. I think that's a very positive step. That's excellent. Thank you. Now I've got Lyndall and then Peter.
Thanks, Chairman. I've got lots of questions, but two most important. Firstly, what do you think we need? Is there anything that we need to do next in terms of improving anything, the system, the IT, the access to the information, in that space? And also then, secondly, in the risk and assurance space, how does some of the risks involved in this, the BAU particularly, but also in the procurement for CapEx or whatever, how does that feed into the risk and assurance conversation, or should it? Two little
I'll lead off with the systems question, and perhaps you take the risk one. So systems wise, I think there's an opportunity to push some of the responsibility back to the suppliers. And as I've commented, it was better this year because some of our really big suppliers are doing it anyway, in terms of they know what work they're doing for us. They know which machine they're using, and they know how many litres of diesel that burns up to do it. So, they're providing really good information. So I think there's an opportunity to further that conversation with other suppliers and put the expectation on them now, whether that's conversation or whether we need to change contracts or procurement manuals and what have you. I don't know, probably kick off a conversation and see where we get to. And that would just make life a whole lot easier. And as I say, concentrating on diesel consumption that just makes it much easier for both parties. So that's probably the big win. It is a reasonably manual process. I guess the question would be if we were able to get suppliers to do that, then when the invoices came through, were we able to capture the amount of litres consumed per that invoice in the financial system would be a question. And then that would be a whole lot easier at the end of the year just to collate it. Because at the present point in time,
Phil's, finance and accounting point, it's exactly that, right?
This is I really like that analogy, Phil, because it's carbon accounting. That's what they call it, and it's and the MFE rules are the same as your financial reporting standards and stuff. So there's a lot of synergies, but it is about there's a lot of it is about our suppliers, and so if we're able to capture their emissions per invoice into our financial system, then it would make life a whole lot easier for the collation.
So Chairman, is that an IRIS?
It would be your authority. It would be your authority. It'd be in there. So it's an accounts payable. It's sort of an accounts payable function. When they're processing the invoice, put in the number of litres.
And just to add to that, if you recall the previous subcommittee meeting, we were talking about our interim organisational GHG emissions reduction plan. One of the key points to that at that point in time was that between baselines, we're wanting to look at organisational systems improvements just to make sure that the inventory is improving over time. So I think if I just even speak on the experience of how that went last year compared to how it went this year, last year we had to run an internal project management team and it was quite intensive and we were all very much like trying to figure this all out. This year was a lot smoother. But there's still a lot of room to go in terms of making sure that that's embedded right throughout the organisation, so that there's a lot more wider awareness across the organisation internally about the need for this and the contribution of each person's work to this. So that would probably be the internally focused answer to sit alongside Neil's externally focused answer.
And as a highlight, a lot of them, doing it this year was far easier than last year. Improvements were made.
We want to continue.
More available.
And the two verification is smoother too.
Amy, did you have something to add?
Yeah, in terms of answering the second part of your question, I think first of all, this would be a jolly good question to ask the independent chair because this is his background as
yes,
well.
Indeed.
Right? But if I was to take an organisational lens on that, I guess it's the point at which council feels that are not achieving its carbon net zero goal is of sufficient concern that it would want that reported. And is it a risk thing or would it come to this committee as a performance against plan thing? I think that's a conversation that would be good to have. But the first step to that being let's get the plan, let's bring that here. I might have misunderstood your question, Councillor, but I think if I was going to answer the bit that I thought it was in the middle in terms of what do we do next? I mean, what we're talking about here is systems change, I think, and there's a really lovely model that I like to use when I'm thinking about that, which comes from a paper which I'm happy to share, actually called The Water Systems Change, but it looks at changing outcomes at an explicit level, so by rules and policies and procedures, at a semi-explicit level, which is thinking about the power dynamics and how you can use people to influence, engage, and then at the very bottom is about mental models, and that's all about how do we change people's beliefs by telling stories? And you can't just focus on one thing. It's quite some program of work. So even changing how people think about things, we need to be talking about them more, and we need to talk about, you know, the why and the stories, not just, you know, please could you do X or Y. So you know, it needs to be quite an integrated approach, I think, to achieve that change over time. And that's not just for us internally, I think that's externally as well.
Thanks, Amy. Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, just quickly, when we start to realise that there may be, I'm just putting it out there, 600 tonnes that are very, very difficult to remove without significant business disruptions, can we have the ability to find that out early? Because there could still go back to our lease land, fitting in with our leading on our lease land project that will happen. There could be areas out there already that could aid with that last 600 tonnes, for example. So know that early instead of at the end would be a good thing. And maybe this person who talked about Amy could help with that. And just a question, does reporting from our contractors naturally lead on to efficiencies from them? Do we have to say it or stress it, or do we leave it to them to understand that we're looking at this, they should be too? So, yeah, just getting that across the board.
So I, through the process of collating, I have spoken to a number of suppliers, and I've given them a heads up, and some of them have asked that question.
Yeah.
So, is this on their radar now? And I said, most definitely is. And you know, I had some good constructive conversations, and some of them are already all over it. You know, they've tried. I don't quite understand it, but a hybrid digger. I don't know how a hybrid digger works, but anyway, they've tried it and they're talking about their experience with that. So, you know, some of them are in that space. And so, you know, I would probably suggest, you know, the opportunity is with procurement to reinforce that. And, you know, RFP, whatever you're doing is to just reinforce that this is our direction of travel, that their emissions are going to be one of our considerations when we're selecting who's going to do a program of work.
So that's our gains there.
Yeah, that's a way.
Yeah.
But the challenge for council, and I'm not saying that there's necessarily a direct correlation, but there may be the situation where they've got less emissions, but it's going to cost a little bit more. So you may have that situation, as is when you're evaluating people. They've got a whole range of factors that you're considering, you know, and so it's not. You know, it may be one that you end up with a trade-off of cost a little bit more, but there's less emissions.
I think we have to expect that. It's like not expecting to pay for recycling, is it?
Yeah. Well,
Pay for your water.
So yes and no though, because again, some of the reason why they have less emissions might be because they're closer to where the work's to be done, so they don't have that commute. So you know, it's not always. There's not always. You know, and I'd caution against thinking that less emissions means more cost, because it doesn't have to. You know, it just means giving consideration to it and making a decision with it as one of your factors.
Thank you, Peter. Those are a couple of really good points there. Is there anything that we want to add to the recommendation to reflect some of this discussion? Or, I mean, Amy, you're on to that report, that we're getting a report on how we can reduce our emissions. We've talked a lot about getting the contractors think more about their emissions as well. Is there anything more that we can do to sort of push
still
that?
at the point where we were with the update at the previous subcommittee meeting, in terms of the way forward being, there's the three factors in terms of improving the emissions inventory systems and things, which is work in progress. We've now got 2 inventories done. And then nutting out actual business cases and things, and emissions reductions opportunities and what they might look like, and then thinking about how that might translate to an emissions reduction pathway. So some of that is going to be assisted by the fact that now we've got 2 inventories. It would even be further assisted by 3. So the more information you collect, the stronger your ability to start going down the track of forecasting emissions, for example, and thinking about, okay, if a project might have, you know, ballpark emissions this much, then that's, you know, weighs in how does that compare to the costs associated with reducing those emissions, and So that information collecting phase that we're going through is actually really important to be able to make sure that we're going to come back to the council with sensible and achievable interim targets towards that net zero 2050 goal. So I think we're still in a place where this is work in progress, it's a learning journey, and we're, I hope, on track for being in a place where we can make some strong recommendations for the next LTP cycle, which was pretty much the update we gave at the previous subcommittee meeting.
Okay, lastly, Peter.
Yeah, just thanks, Mr. Chair. Just in regard to that, so the council has the resources and the ability to understand this process and work it out as we go. Is there any thought being given to sharing that and put it and using it to the ability to wider public, you know, through the regional group or something along like that, so people don't have to go on this time-consuming, cost-consuming journey that we're going on, so we can show a bit of an example to the community. Great South, I know, is probably involved, been doing all this sort of stuff for a while, so can we get to a point that once we're confident enough, has there been any thought given to that?
So there is an existing staff interagency working group that supports the governance level regional climate change working group, and at the staff level there's kind of like a subgroup that's like has been specifically getting together to nut this out, and Invercargill City Council was the first council in Southland to do their baseline, so with them a little bit ahead of the game, we were able to learn a lot from them. Environment Southland and Southland District Council have both done that baseline approach, and Gore District Council was sort of in the early stages of that. So that staff working group is a really good information sharing and learning opportunity that's already happening. And then recently at the governance level regional climate change working group, we had a workshop in the context of the phase 2 thinking around what might be important to go or considered to go into the regional framework for action. And so that workshop in July focused specifically on the mitigation aspirations. And so there was a whole lot of layers that got covered off in that workshop, and organisational measurement and emissions reduction was one of those layers. And then beyond that, there's also a chunk of work to work through the regional inventory and emissions reduction conversation. So that's like 2 key components that sit under those mitigation aspirations. So that workshop, in hindsight, became a really useful learning opportunity as well to bring us collectively up to speed with where everybody's at in relation to those mitigation aspirations in the regional climate change strategy. So I guess where we're at now would be thinking about how can we start extending that conversation. When will we be confident enough, I guess you could say, to extend that, broaden that conversation so that we're going to have that more broadly with the community.
Yeah. Could I suggest that maybe just consideration like Beef and Lamb have what they call a greenhouse calculator that's widely available, and that could just get people understanding the situation without any direct liability for the council or the regional group, but just get people understanding where they sit in the world is a big bonus for our overall lowering emissions around the region. It could be just some very basic calculator you could put on the website or something along those lines. It could be something.
Lyndall, did you have something?
Yeah, it just reminded me 2 things actually. That Dish hub would be the good place to put this. That's the Great South data hub that Bobby spoke to us about last week, the week before. So I'm thinking that's probably a good place to put all the TAs, all the local authorities information. But I appreciate there's probably things that I don't know or understand. And that's based. The other thing is, how do we compare to other regional councils of our size in this with this data? Do we know?
No,
I don't need to, we just better.
Well, I know that, but you know, we need to tell other people about it.
So in the report we have, so I don't have a comparison, but I guess just to make it available or easier, I did include a metric in terms of the amount of emissions per FTE and the amount of emissions per community member, just so that, that's probably a basis of comparatives against other councils.
Yeah, okay. I haven't looked.
Okay, so we've got a recommendation there that we receive the report. So more questions or discussion, we can.
I will move.
Thank you, Eric. Second up, Peter. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried on. Thank you very much, Neil and Amy.
Takes a special kind of brain to do that work.
Very fulsome.
Right, Laura.
Page are we on now, Chair? Very helpful. Yes, so we are.
Right, welcome.
Oh, she will. Moving to
Welcome,
Scotland.
Laura Pope is here from the National Public Health Service, is that right?
Yes.
And we've got your report, Laura. It's a very comprehensive one. So if you'd like to take us through that, we've got plenty of time. So no question for time or anything. It's a very important aspect of the effects of climate change on us all.
Thank you, Councillor Rodway. I just, before Laura starts, just want to say that in a similar vein to the interagency sort of discussions that take place in a GHG sense, organisational GHG sense, when the report that's attached to this agenda item, when that came out, when that came out, we sort of reached out. Somehow it happened that we started having some interagency discussions around what the relationship looks like between climate change and health. And so we've had a series of interagency meetings around that, and what's come through from that is potential for thinking how the Canterbury version of the report could be sort of thought through in a Southland context. And so that's a little bit of the background in terms of how Laura's come to be at the table today. And then the other thing too was Laura, on behalf of Te Whatu Ora, was a submitter as part of the phase 1 regional climate change strategy process. And so that submission was considered by the Regional Climate Change Working Group panel. And yeah, it gave food for thought to the hearing panel. So yeah, some of the those messages, I presume, will be part of that presentation today too, which I think would be really useful for the Climate Change Subcommittee to consider. I guess that we're quite often focused on environmental impact and flood risk and water, and so the idea of thinking about the impact of climate change from a slightly different perspective was what brought rise to this opportunity today. So just that's a little bit of the background and context, and hand over to Laura from here.
Yes, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a policy advisor, but more specifically called a health and all policies advisor. So my role is to work externally with partners external to the health system to influence the determinants of health. So for example, working with local council, regional council on the determinants of health and how their policies, plans and processes affect things like recreational water, transport, housing, air quality, and then how those things affect on health and wellbeing. I'm a part of a regional team expanding the South Island, and because of this I've been able to draw upon my work colleagues in Ototahi Christchurch, and a lot of this presentation actually comes from their resources. So next slide, please. So this is the report that they did, the Climate Change in Health in Waitaha Canterbury, and I really suggest that if you have time to go and read it because it's a great document. This mahi arose, as Uncle said, from the Regional Council, Environment Canterbury and Christchurch City Council expressing their desire to do something in terms of climate change and health. I just want to put a disclaimer out there. I'm not a climate scientist and I've only been working in this space for a short period of time, but I have experience in public health and have done a few years in that space, so hopefully I can bring some insight there. So to start with, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that climate change is often a story about risks and vulnerability, and this presentation does add to that story as I'm trying to highlight the relationship between climate hazards and risks and impacts to health outcomes. But I also want to acknowledge the story of hope as frequently discussed by other climate change thinkers. And I'm going to start by sharing this quote that you see on the screen. What if climate change meant not doom, but abundance? To respond to the climate crisis, a disaster on a more immense scale than anything our species has faced. We can and must summon what people facing disasters have. A sense of meaning, of deep connection and generosity, of being truly alive in the face of uncertainty, of joy. I like that quote. So why are we, the National Public Health Service, talking about climate change? Well, it comes back to one of our favourite models here, which is called the Dahlgren and Whitehead model on the determinants of health and wellbeing. And if you've received any submissions from us recently, we always reference this model. As you can see in the centre, we have people, so us and the factors that we can't really control. And as you go outward in the model, you can see how different elements of our lifestyle through to our built natural environment and right out to the global ecosystem and how they all impact on us as individuals. And as you can see on the outside, we also have biodiversity and climate change. The World Health Organization and the Lancet have also called climate change one of the biggest risks to public health in the 21st century. And we understand that health outcomes and climate change can be closely linked. We in the National Public Health Service also have a focus on equity and upholding te tiriti o waitangi. We understand that we want to lead an equitable transition for Māori led by Māori. Climate change responses can also have health co-benefits and support. We support a health-centred approach to climate change. I just wanted to highlight that there has been international action in this space and that we have a lot of frameworks and agreements that have gone before us that have gotten us to the place that we're in today. And also in the national legislation, we have obligations, as I'm sure you're all aware. So this diagram highlights the risks and vulnerabilities associated with climate change. As you can see in the centre there, we have our risk, and above it is our climate hazards. So in this example, we have flooding or heat waves. With the example of a flood, the exposure to the individual population could be that their home is displaced by the effects of flooding. The vulnerability could be things that the individual may personally face. They could be elderly and have disabilities. They could be living in a particularly isolated area, like a rural space. And these things combined can create a significant amount of risk for the individual or the population. So this is our model that was developed from the report. This is the direct and indirect effects of climate change on health and wellbeing. Sorry, it looks a lot smaller on the screen. But today I want to go through each of these segments and show how climate hazards then impact onto our health and wellbeing. So we will start first with the climate hazards. So climate change risks and vulnerability assessments tend to focus on these hazards, and this is something that I'm sure you are all very familiar with. Part of the assessment of climate hazards is trying to predict and understand the frequency and severity of these hazards so that councils like yourself and communities and households can adapt and mitigate these hazards. The predicting of these hazards are based on emission trends and emission scenarios and help us to understand the likelihood of them in the future. But as we all know, climate change is already happening, and the images on the slide depict some of the recent events in Aotearoa, probably not as recent now, but we have in 2023 some of the flooding in Auckland, but also we have some fire and fire damages in the back and the bottom slide. And looking to the future and the future predictions, we still have choices that we can make and opportunities that can reduce the likelihood of the worst case scenarios. And so our climate hazards that we've listed here are flooding, storms and extreme wind, sea level rise, temperature rise, heat waves, drought and fires. So then coming back to the model, we are now going to go on to impacts and pathways and look at how the climate hazards interact with our built and natural environment. Just to simplify our discussion, I'm going to focus on one particular climate hazard, which is flooding. So as you can see here, these are the effects of the flooding in Auckland in 2023. So some of the effects on the built environment were that homes were damaged and people were displaced. Auckland floods showed us the damage to housing, both immediate impacts and ongoing impacts. Nearly 1,500 homeowners were still waiting to find out if their property could be repaired or bought out by the council. And then on the bottom you can see that's a road, and there has been a slip that's come through there. So more than 2,000 slips and issues were reported across the region during the storm events of 2023, and Auckland overall flood repair program is expected to take 2 to 3 years and cost over 390 million. There can also be other issues such as drinking water, debris and cleanup. When we look at the health system and health services, staff can be stuck and unable to reach people or come to work because of the roads being damaged. Emergency services may be less accessible, and power outages and damage can interrupt communication systems. So you can really see some of the impact from these climate hazards. So then in the third segment, we have the determinants of health, which I previously discussed a little bit. So we define these as the conditions in which people are born, grow up, live, learn, work and age. Like the pathways previously discussed, the determinants of health can mediate the relationship between climate change and health. These determinants how well we will determine how well we respond to the impacts of a climate change disaster. Age is key in determining our capacity to respond, and probably something we don't normally think about, but for children and older people, they can be more vulnerable compared to others with the ability to cope and respond. And some other things that we think about in this space are likes of disabilities and how able people are. Also, rural communities can be disconnected. We also think about socioeconomic status and that sort of thing when we're talking about the determinants of health. So then finally, in the purple segment, we have our health and wellbeing impacts. So these are a list of some of the things that were identified that could become issues as a result of climate hazards, and this is why they're displayed on the pathway. They can be cascading and compounding impacts from climate change through pathways and the determinants of health. This means that by focusing on the zones in between, so the orange and the blue segment there, we can reduce the worst health impacts. So if we think in the context of flooding, if somebody had a house that was displaced and they were in a rural space, they may not be able to access the services and things that they need if they've been injured in the event of a flood. And then I also have the example of heat waves, just to re-emphasize how this model is used. So heat waves can impact built infrastructure, is a lot of our homes are created to keep heat in, and which is great in winter, of course, but when we get into those hotter temperatures, it can become an issue. There has also been issues with ACs, blasting. Lots of cool air can put a strain on our energy system. And actually, this is what happened in Chicago in the heat wave in 1995. And the power outages meant people couldn't cool their homes in oppressive heat in top story buildings. Water pumps weren't able to pump due to the lack of power. And unfortunately, a number of people died because they weren't able to leave their homes. So when we think about that in the pathway, there was an accessibility issue. If somebody was older or wasn't as able, they might not be able to get help, and this means that the impacts that they experience on their health and well-being are a lot more severe. And so the heat impacts can be things like migraines and dehydration, heat stroke, but these can become quite severe. And I have the headline there that France recorded over 5,000 deaths due to summer in 2023 heat. So it may have happened in Chicago in 1995, but unfortunately this is still something that we are dealing with today. This diagram, I can send it to you after. This is quite a nice depiction as to how flooding can impact all of the different elements between our community. So we have like the individual, but we also have schools and farming. We have food services. In the instance your road is blocked off, you might not be able to get to food and water. And that could be for days or it could be for hours, we don't know. And then we also have heat waves. We have a couple of other depictions of these diagrams as well, so I can send them to you. And so what can we do to try and improve these health outcomes? Well, we believe it's important to have an equity and health-centred approach to climate action for a thriving future. We believe that it's important to work collaboratively with communities, and that's why I'm here today, because it's important that we work together rather than in isolation. We believe it's important to have a focus on equity and te ao Māori. As I highlighted within the social determinants of health, there are particular groups that need extra care and other services more than the individual that is more able. We also have, there is an importance on social connectedness, and this is particularly important for mental health. As I'm sure you're aware, urban infrastructure and housing is important, but also our natural environments and green spaces, and these can be a source towards a solution, and transport and accessibility. I just thought it would be important to emphasise social connectedness and mental health. It is important to encourage and enhance social connectedness, social cohesion, and social networks in a community. It ensures greater community resilience and protects against the worst health and wellbeing outcomes against climate change. And the reason I read the quote at the start is because, often we hear the messaging about climate change in quite a it could be quite a scary context for a lot of people, and it's important that we have strong community ties to help bring people together and create positivity. And as a solution-based approach, we have urban infrastructure and housing, and I'm sure you're aware of some of these solutions. But with flooding, there is a thing called spongy city approaches or nature-based solutions. Under heat waves, providing lots of trees and planting to provide shade, but also having accessible drinking fountains and providing cooling spaces. And monitoring water quality, which I know you do. And then finally, to close, health systems need to support climate action, and we have a role to play, especially in the advocacy space. We have different platforms and spaces in which we can contribute to climate action. It can be in our own workspaces, our transport choices, or in our local engagement with our communities. It can be strengthening relationships with neighbours, growing food in our local community garden, or being involved to reduce waste. It can be procuring more sustainable products for your workplace, strengthening climate change policies and strategies. There are many things, and we all have a part to play to create collective action. Change the story of climate change, climate doom to climate hope and climate action, and possibilities of creating healthier, more equitable and climate resilient communities. So thank you so much for listening to me today.
Interesting.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sure there are some of those. Peter.
Mr. Chairman, that's very good. Thank you, Lloyd. I'm interested in up there is respiratory diseases and probably looking at temperature increases. We see that in New Zealand, and especially, or my take on it, whether I'm right or wrong, is that that's been borne out in our winter time with temperatures being higher and wetter. So a wetter winter time temperature, what's that going to affect on those diseases creeping in around respiratory diseases? Has there been any work of what to expect in the future, do you think?
I think it's a space that we're still trying to measure, and I think some of these things that we have listed are the impacts in which, like you said, if we have homes that are creating dampness and mold and things like that, that produces respiratory diseases, and we can see that. So I think it's a multifaceted beast, and I don't think there's any clear cut, yes, this is going to cause X amount of diseases, but I think it's more being aware in the ways in which we can, I guess, reduce some of the impact in which they could increase. I don't know if that quite answers the question.
That's right. And just to follow on from that, saw open floods in Spain. Major problem with when you have floods, you have actually dried sediment in behind it, and the clean up for that. So there's been reports of that being pretty bad over there as they clean up. Do we have to give any thought to that in the future and how we manage flood cleanup in built up areas, in urban areas, instead of just going in there with the dozers and the diggers, and maybe that's the thing too.
Yeah, well, I again, I'm not an expert in that space, but I definitely think it's important to understand how different communities may have different experiences and things like that, and learning from them, and how we can improve our spaces so that, we don't have that issue, or if we have that issue, how we approach that. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Any others? Cool.
Got a few questions. Does your organisation have any research capacity that can be employed at a regional level? We had questions relating to the intersection of health and climate change, and some questions that we wanted answered. Have you guys got capacity to lean into that, or is that not something you've got?
Previously, I would have said yes, but as you may or may not be aware, we are currently about to go through a restructure and or a reset, and so I'm not exactly sure on what our capacity is and what our focus towards climate change will be. We've recently found out some of our the things that we are going to be focused on, but that's not to say that if you had questions, I couldn't ask them within, internally. We have a national intelligence team that respond to different requests, but I do know that the capacity is quite thin. We were in the process of trying to develop a document like this for the South Island, and we were going to start with Southland, which is why I'm here today. However, that's been put on hold at the moment. So hopefully, I'm optimistic that next year we can get some things in line. But yeah, as I said, if you have questions, it would be great to send them our way, and then I can follow that up for you.
Yeah, so I guess there was 3 areas of interest to me that your presentation triggered. One was if we were to take the data on what we think will be the impact on Southland as climate change progresses, we, in the future, I imagine, will not represent Southland as it looks today, but we will potentially represent another existing region somewhere in the world. You could kind of establish, well, we expect that you will be like this place is today. So a reference climate, if you like, or a reference place which says you are more likely to be like they are today. And what are the insights that they are learning? What's their current set of health challenges? So that idea of understanding or trying to establish a reference climate to then draw insights from might be helpful to us. That would be one line of inquiry I had. Another one was, what are Southland's unique challenges? Because we're unlike Canterbury, we are unlike Auckland, and we are a rural-centric region. It's interesting to reflect that the record wet September and October that we just experienced kind of represents possibly the most insidious form of climate change risk that we may face, because it's death by 1,000 cuts for our rural sector. Each day it rains a bit more. You hope it won't rain tomorrow, but it does rain again tomorrow. Your livestock don't thrive, your profits go down, mental health issues emerge. No one's watching it saying there's a flood, let's declare an emergency. It just happens and it plays out over the two-month period. That to me seems like that could be, for South and one of the nasty types of hazards, and it's not reflected in that range of hazards that were outlined in the presentation, but it may be one that we need to start thinking about and paying attention to as the one that's going to really knock the momentum out of Southland, both from an economic, social and health perspective in the future. So that would kind of be another line of inquiry if there was research capacity to have a look at what has been the effect on that this year. What does that mean for us in future years as we move forward? So
if I can just speak to that, in the report it does discuss some of those issues that you're talking about, like the economic loss and things like you're saying livestock and things like that. Like those are very real issues for those communities, and so it does kind of touch on some of those impacts. But you are right in saying that maybe we could have a bit more of a tailoring towards that.
And I guess we had the 3 intersecting circles of the risk model, and it just occurred to me, I wonder if you added next to that, because I was inspired by your opening quote about opportunity. There must be a corresponding opportunity model as well, and if you look at the two together, what are the opportunities inherent in this? And maybe if there was potential to explore what insights that might shed, that would be really interesting to explore, both from us thinking through the climate change things as a region, but also what other climates will help. Because maybe with such a dispersed and ageing community, maybe it is about things like transport networks and bridges and communications. Maybe that's where the best bang from our buck in terms of investing our limited resources. So just those are some of the kind of, I guess, researchy kind of questions that emerge from me having listened to your presentations. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think that if we could identify what our issues are for our region, and then understand what they are, so that we could almost take this as a metric and see how that would play out for us as a population, that would be really great.
Thanks. So I'm not sure I've got a question. I've just got stuff to
No,
say.
it's great.
I'm sorry. There might be a question in there. Just really interested, particularly in your equity statements and the particularly the Māori health and equity you know, that's a real concern just on a daily, right? And I guess if it's a question, it's, you know, you've highlighted the impacts of a significant hazard, but to Phil's point about the kind of the insidious nature of climate change, and things are just, you know, things just slowly have changed, and you know, and for the daily lives of particularly the Māori population and the Pacifica population in Southland, there's a whole raft of housing and transport and access to facilities and services that are already impacted by climate change. So it's you know, I think there's work to do, and there's a lot of social organisations that would find that information really valuable if there was some more data about that kind of access and equity space. And you mentioned quite often you know, people who are old or you know, disabled or you know, whatever, but actually as a really good example, I've got a friend who lives in South Dunedin, and she's terminally ill. And she was at home at this point during the Dunedin floods, just most recently. Couldn't evacuate really because she was, you know, unwell enough not to actually go anywhere, and fortunately was safe enough. But nor could her registered nurse and her health support get to her in her home because the roads were closed. So there's also that issue of the impact of flooding, and you know, and those people are living in vulnerable places in the first place. There's that aspect of the health system and the impact of climate change on just people's daily that's definitely needs some more, especially Southland specific data, because we have a huge Māori and Pacifica population that are really, really vulnerable, alongside all the other cultures that are really vulnerable. So yeah, interested in your equities parts there, and there's the transportation, there's the housing, there's the biodiversity, there's the green spaces, there's the spongy cities, all of that stuff has a health impact, and we're responsible for air quality. So add that in as well. Thanks.
Thanks,
Might I just add one?
I'm not sure.
I think I was just going to reflect that all of that stuff about equity is really, really valid, and I'm also imagining potential in the future for there to be more climate refugees, and potentially being a recipient of a climate refugee population 20 years hence, who knows, and making sure that we respond to their equity needs in that situation potentially.
Yeah, definitely.
But something to think about.
Yeah, but it's good. It's really good. It's really good.
Thank you, you two. I agree that, you know, this leads on to what we can do here. If we look at page 124 of the Waitaha report, there's a group of paragraphs headed response priorities, and in there, at a high level, are, you know, I think answer a lot of the questions that you have brought up, Phil and Lyndall. And I just wonder, Phil, this is more of a question to you, and perhaps Anka as well, is how can we, and are we, incorporating these things into our regional climate change strategy? Because it seems to me that we are addressing some of these things, but maybe not all. Phil.
Oh, we set that, don't we?
Yeah, no, good question. I'll defer to Anka. No, I guess we to date have been quite, I'll use the term divergent, and thinking through the range of responses that might be appropriate for a local government coalition to consider as we move forward. We are getting to a point though where, as we start to frame up a framework for action and the resulting action plan that flows from that, we're going to have to start being convergent and being discerning around where we apply our limited resources, knowing that if we collaborate across all of the councils, synergy seems possible, so that our limited resources will go further. That's one thing. Two, by collaborating and cooperating, again, we can offset costs and potentially deliver a greater impact for our community. I think we have to acknowledge that, one, our resources are limited and we need to seek a mandate from our community to make investments that represent something above and beyond business as usual. And we imagine that that's probably best likely advanced through the LTP process on a 3-yearly cycle. And add to that, that there will be uncertainty moving forward, and there's probably a need to renew and revisit that on a 3-yearly basis anyway. So any idea is currently being considered, but at some point we're going to have to say, well, yes to this, no to that, or maybe that could be something we do later, but we need to try and understand what's going to deliver the greatest impact for a reasonable investment moving forward. That makes sense. So that's that balancing act. And I might explain it in more simple terms because it'll probably be clumsy and see all of that.
So only thing to add there in terms of I don't have the answer based on where we're at in the process. But if you think back to our floodplain management workshops that are work in progress at the moment, and you think back in terms of the 4 R's that we've got, reduction, readiness, response, and recovery. If you think in terms of a response to an event, you generally have a very clear set of priorities around protection of life in the first instance, and property, and there's a bit of a hierarchy there that you work through in terms of assessing what are you going to respond to first and how, and so life's right up there. And I guess there's work in progress and work that needs to be done to think about how you would evaluate those priorities either in a similar sense or differently depending on which phase of those R's you're in. So in a reduction setting, I think this is the kind of information that really needs some consideration to how does that inform the priorities of where you are spending your investments to reduce the impact of climate change. So, for example, your concern or about equity or vulnerable populations, and what sort of mechanisms would you think that are higher priority to pursue because of consideration of these kinds of holistic thinking. So we're not just blinkered about one particular effect, but we're thinking of it broadly in a holistic sense. So work in progress.
And maybe just to add to it, the reality is that if we look at the world today, it is a very urban world with a lot of urbanisation, and a lot of the thinking around climate resilience is focused on cities and people living in large quantities. And we're the opposite, And so for Auckland, a light rail system and decarbonising transport is going to deliver a greater impact for that community. In Southland, decarbonising transport is not going to deliver the impact. There's different solutions that we need to consider in our large area and a small dispersed population. We need to think quite differently about how we respond to climate resilience. So we can't just copy and paste solutions from elsewhere to the Southland context. We need to be quite discerning to understand how we might apply insights from around the world to the Southland context.
I don't know if you answered that completely, or maybe I didn't understand, but I think if we were all to read through those response priorities and bring them to the regional climate change working group as a sort of a checklist to make sure that we are addressing those issues, because some of them are, they're not, like you mentioned before, about that incessant rain that we've had in the springtime. That's not something you normally associate with climate change, or Laura, as you gave in your talk about heat waves, that's the sort of thing that is something that doesn't happen all at once, but it sort of comes on and it affects people in different ways. So anyway, that's a thing for regional climate forum. Yes, I've got you, Peter. Sorry, I haven't forgotten about you. Is that okay, Phil?
Yeah, no.
Peter.
Yeah, it's just an interesting discussion. You talked about climate refugees and different responses. You can cut and paste. Do we need to think at some stage long term about the stress of people on the move wanting to live in a pretty climate friendly place like the bottom half of the end of the South Island, and how our institutions, especially our health institutions, will cope with people on the move. I know it's pretty destabilising in a military sense, Phil, you'll know that, but still on our institutions it can be very destabilising too.
Well, especially if you don't build your hospital big enough.
Yeah, well, these are all the things that we probably should have some discussion about, because it will reflect back to human health, won't it? So is that something that the regional group in time will start to have some discussions about?
Yeah, and my thoughts are that as long as you don't lose sight of this important connection, if you make sure it remains visible in people's thinking and in their conversation, the connection between climate change, resilience and health outcomes, I would like to think that we'll make sensible collective decision moving forward. That's why we've got adult supervision and governance meetings is to help with that. Yeah, but as I say, it's about taking it as much as possible a future-focused but integrated perspective of the possible actions that might be considered, is probably what I'm thinking. And being prepared to review and revisit those decisions on a regular basis to see, well, what's changed, what assumptions did we get wrong, what's changed in our situation that would prompt us to think differently about a response to the situation.
Lyndall, did you have something else?
Yeah, just one comment about the climate refugees. I would suggest, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, that we will have climate refugees within our region. Right? We're not necessarily talking about people coming from the North Island or Australia. You know, some of the climate changes are going to make some of our Southlanders, you know, kind of refugees in their own region, because they may not be able to function in the productive way that they are at the moment. And so, in a sense, they will also become climate refugees, and they may be looking for different uses for their land, or they might be wanting to shift, you know, to a more urban setting, or vice versa. I mean, who knows? But just wanted to highlight that actually, when we use the term refugee, you know, maybe we don't have to be considering anything too far away.
Very true. All right. Well, thank you very much, Laura. That was very good and created a lot of discussion and a lot of thought. And I think, you know, we maybe hadn't thought about some of those things in your report, so that's really good. We'll make sure that we do take notice of that and incorporate that into our plans and policies in the future. And you'll make sure that we do. I hope.
And keep in touch.
Right.
Thank you so much.
So we've got a recommendation to receive that report. Somebody'd like to move that? Peter, seconder. Bill. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Thank you. And the item 10 is extraordinary business, of which there is none, and public excluded business, of which there is none. So I declare the meeting closed. And thank you for your attendance.
It's fascinating.
Do you want an update on America at this stage?
Oh,
Go on.
no, only if it's good.